It was an ordinary Friday evening, or so I thought. My best friend, Rick, had come over to hang out, like he did most weekends. We were just lounging in the living room, talking about nothing and everything, when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. It was my stepmom, Nora. At 63, she still had a way of making people stop and notice her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that I hadn't really thought much about before. But lately, something about her had changed. The way she dressed, the way she looked at people. It was like she knew just what kind of attention she commanded. Rick noticed it too. I could tell by the way his gaze trailed after her whenever she was around. It wasn't something we talked about, but I knew he felt it. That night, Nora had on a silk robe, loosely tied at the waist, just barely hiding what was underneath. She walked into the room holding 2 glasses of wine, wearing a warm smile that somehow made my heart race. "You boys look like you're having a good time," she said, offering us each a glass. "Mind if I join in?" Rick looked over at me, clearly caught off guard, but neither of us said no. She settled between us on the couch, her legs crossing just enough for the robe to slide up, and I could feel the tension creep into the room. I tried to keep my focus on the TV, but it was impossible to ignore how close she was sitting, or the way Rick kept glancing at her. After a moment, she leaned in closer, her voice softer now. "I've noticed how you look at me sometimes," she said, her eyes shifting between Rick and me. My heart skipped a beat. Rick looked just as startled as I felt, but he didn't say anything, and neither did I. I wasn't sure where she was going with this, but her gaze lingered on us in a way that made it clear she was aware of the effect she had. Nora's hand rested gently on my leg, lingering just long enough to send a strange, unexpected warmth through me. Then she shifted her hand toward Rick's, brushing his arm. Her voice was almost a whisper as she said, "I hope I haven't made you both uncomfortable." "I'm not offended at all." She smiled, a hint of something playful in her expression that I'd never seen before. I caught Rick's eyes for a moment, both of us unsure, but Nora's calmness had a way of softening the awkwardness. I felt strangely at ease, like she knew exactly how to handle this without making it feel wrong. And I was beginning to realize that I trusted her, more than I had trusted anyone in a long time. "You two don't need to worry about being here with me," she continued, her voice warm and reassuring. "It's just nice to feel close with people you care about." Rick's expression softened, and I could see he felt the same relief. It was Nora's way of putting everything out in the open, reminding us that this was just a moment of comfort, of shared understanding. Nora's gaze shifted between us, calm yet carrying a quiet confidence. She took a breath, her voice gentle but resolute. "It's okay, you know? Life's full of twists, and sometimes it's nice to have people close." Rick and I looked at each other, and for the first time in a long time, the tension in the room melted away, replaced with something softer, like we were just 3 people, finding connection in an unexpected way. The quiet between us was no longer awkward, just peaceful. After a while, Nora excused herself, leaving Rick and me to talk. We shared a look, both processing everything. "Well," Rick finally said, his voice low, "guess life has its surprises." I chuckled, nodding. "It sure does." Nora's warmth, her ability to embrace life's complications without judgment, had left a mark on both of us. The rest of the evening went by in easy conversation and laughter, and by the time Rick headed home, I felt lighter somehow, knowing that no matter where life went next, we had something solid, unspoken, that tied us together. And that night, as I looked around the quiet house, I felt a gratitude I hadn't expected, knowing I wasn't facing life's twists alone. The days that followed took on a different kind of rhythm. Every morning, I'd come downstairs and find Nora already at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, a soft smile greeting me. She was as steady as the sun rising, and just her being there somehow made everything feel simpler. One evening, as we shared dinner on the back porch, Nora looked out over the fields, her gaze distant but warm. "Feels like a good life here," she said, her voice soft. "It is," I agreed and then added, "but it's better with company." Nora looked at me with a thoughtful smile, And I realized then how long it had been since I felt this close to someone, felt this much peace just sitting side by side with someone who understood. Our talks grew longer, sometimes stretching into the night. And in those moments, we opened up about everything, our fears, our regrets, and the parts of life that had shaped us. We spoke about family, lost loves, and the quiet ache that life can sometimes bring. Every story she shared felt like a gift, a piece of herself that she offered freely, without expectation or demand. Then one evening, after Rick stopped by for dinner, I watched as he and Nora shared a light-hearted joke. There was a sense of ease between us all, a simple joy in the company. As Rick got ready to leave, he turned to both of us, his voice warm. "You know, this feels like family," he said, and there was a softness in his gaze, something genuine that went beyond words. After he left, Nora looked at me, her eyes shining under the porch light.
"He's a good friend," she said.
I nodded. "The best I've ever had, truthfully." She took my hand, gave it a gentle squeeze, and for the first time, I realized that we had created something special here, friendship, family, or whatever one could call it. We didn't need to define it. All that mattered was that we had it. And so, each night, as the stars appeared overhead, we sat on that porch, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the quiet. I had spent so much of my life searching for something I couldn't name, and here, with Nora's laughter filling the silence, I realized I had finally found it. As the summer days continued, Nora and I settled into an easy rhythm. We shared morning coffee on the porch, the sun casting golden light across the fields. When she'd laugh, it would carry on the breeze, a sound I'd come to look forward to more than anything else. On a late August afternoon, we took a long walk to the far end of the property, where a small pond reflected the sky's endless blue. We stood quietly by the water, watching the sunlight dance across its surface, lost in the simple beauty of it. "You know, there's peace in being here with you," she said after a while, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Life just feels real again." I glanced at her, seeing something in her expression that felt familiar. "I feel that too. It's like we've somehow stumbled into the life we were both looking for." Nora looked at me, her gaze soft but intent. "I think that's exactly what we've done, Will." In that moment, it was clear. There were no questions to ask, no doubts to resolve. We knew this was something we hadn't planned, but it was everything we'd needed. The world seemed to fall silent, leaving just the two of us in that golden light, an unspoken understanding settling between us. She took my hand, and we stood there, hand in hand by the water, feeling like we'd known each other for a lifetime. There was no rush. We simply enjoyed the quiet presence of each other, letting the silence speak in ways words never could. From that day on, things changed between us in subtle but profound ways. Our friendship had deepened, transforming into a companionship that felt more like home than anything I'd ever known. And with every day that passed, the unspoken bond between us grew stronger. By the time fall arrived, the leaves on the trees around the farm had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. The air grew cooler, and the scent of earth and wood smoke filled the evenings. As we spent those autumn days harvesting, storing away, and preparing for winter, I realized just how full my life had become. One cool October evening, we stood together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars stretch across the night sky. "Will," she began softly, her voice barely a whisper in the dark, "I never thought I'd find this kind of peace again." I looked at her, feeling the same. "You brought it with you, Nora. And now I don't ever want to let it go." In that quiet, starlit moment, I knew that whatever came next, whatever life had in store, we'd face it together, hand in hand, sharing a love as steady as the turning of the seasons, a peace we'd finally found in each other's arms. The days shortened, and a chill began to settle over the land, bringing the first hints of winter. Nora and I had spent the past few weeks getting everything ready, the firewood stacked high, the garden beds cleared, and the farmhouse cozied up with blankets and candles for the long, cold nights ahead. The farmhouse transformed into a true haven, and in this peaceful rhythm of shared work and quiet moments, I found myself grateful in ways I hadn't anticipated. One evening, we sat together by the fire, the soft crackling filling the silence. Nora leaned back, her face lit by the amber glow of the flames, a quiet contentment in her eyes. "Will," she said, her voice warm and soft, "it's strange, but sometimes I feel like I've lived this life with you 1,000 times before." I looked at her, feeling a resonance in her words. Maybe we have. Maybe, in some way, we were always meant to end up here, just like this. She smiled, and I saw a trace of sadness in her expression, mingling with the peace she had found here. It reminded me that while we'd come a long way together, both of us had carried our own losses, scars, and lessons from years past. It was part of what had brought us together, a shared understanding of life's heartaches, its joys, and the importance of finding someone to stand beside through it all. As the fire burned low and the quiet wrapped around us, Nora moved closer, resting her head against my shoulder. I wrapped an arm around her, and we sat like that, watching the flames fade. In that stillness, with nothing but the soft warmth of her beside me, I felt a contentment deeper than anything I'd ever known. When winter finally came, bringing snow and long, frosty nights, the farmhouse became our own little world. We spent mornings by the window with coffee, watching the white landscape stretch out in every direction. In the evenings, we'd cook dinner together, sharing stories, or sometimes just listening to the sound of the wind moving through the pines outside. It was a simple life, but it was full. Each moment spent together felt more meaningful than the last. One snowy evening, after a long day working in the barn, Nora and I made our way back to the farmhouse, snowflakes falling softly around us. She turned to me, her cheeks rosy from the cold, her eyes bright. Without a word, she reached for my hand, and we stood there in the snow, letting the silence settle over us, a quiet smile passing between us. In that moment, I realized that all those years of searching, all the heartache, and the doubts had led me to this, to a woman who brought warmth into every corner of my life, who turned the farmhouse into a place filled with light and laughter. "Nora," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I never thought I'd find a love like this." She looked at me, her expression soft, and reached up, placing a gentle hand on my cheek. "You're my home, Will," she said. We stood there in the snow, wrapped in each other's warmth, feeling the quiet understanding of what we'd found together, a love that didn't need grand gestures or promises, just the simple, steady presence of each other. As winter deepened, we settled fully into the rhythm of our life together. Snow piled high around the farmhouse, insulating us in a peaceful silence. We'd walk through the woods some days, bundled in coats and scarves, breathing in the crisp air, and other days we'd work on little projects around the house. Nora took up knitting, creating scarves and blankets in rich, warm colors, while I tinkered with restoring old furniture that had been left in the barn for years. We filled the house with small things we'd made ourselves, and it felt like we were creating a history together, one piece at a time. One evening, after supper, Nora sat in her armchair by the fire, knitting and humming quietly to herself. I watched her, her hands moving gracefully over the yarn, her face soft and content in the warm glow of the flames. There was something timeless in that moment, something that felt like it belonged to another era, like a scene from an old story. It struck me that I'd never truly known peace until I'd known her. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "I feel like every day I'm learning something new about you." She looked up, her smile gentle and knowing. "And what did you learn today, Will?" "That you hum when you're lost in thought," I replied. "And that you make the best stew I've ever had." She laughed softly, her laughter filling the room with warmth. "Well, I'm glad you noticed. Though I'd say it's about time you've learned to appreciate my cooking." We shared a laugh, the warmth between us feeling like a shield against the winter outside. As I watched her, I thought about how our life had settled into something I'd only dreamed of, a quiet, constant companionship, the kind that didn't need grand displays to prove its worth. It was there in the small gestures, the unspoken understanding, the way we moved through our days together. It was a love that had grown naturally, like the roots of a tree spreading steadily beneath the surface. As spring approached, the snow began to melt, revealing the rich soil beneath. We started making plans for the garden, choosing seeds, and mapping out where we'd plant each crop. It felt like the beginning of something new, a season of growth, not just for the land but for us as well. One morning, as we planted the first seeds in the garden, I looked over at Nora, her hands covered in earth, her hair falling in soft waves around her face. She caught my gaze and smiled, her eyes bright with joy and promise. "I never imagined this life, she said, her voice filled with wonder. "But I wouldn't trade it for anything." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Neither would I." As we stood there, our hands entwined, surrounded by the first signs of spring, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had brought us to this moment. We had built a life together that was rooted in something real, something steady and enduring, and as the days grew warmer, I knew that our love, like the seeds we'd planted, would only continue to grow, season by season, year after year. Over the following weeks, the farm seemed to come alive as each planted seed began to take root. Flowers bloomed along the edges of the garden, their colors vibrant against the green of the fields. Nora and I spent our days tending to the plants, pulling weeds, watering and watching as the garden transformed from bare soil to a tapestry of greens, yellows, and reds. One sunny afternoon, I watched Nora carefully check on the tomatoes, her fingers brushing the leaves tenderly, almost reverently. There was a quiet pride in her eyes as she straightened, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Can you believe we grew all this?" she said, looking out over the garden with a mix of surprise and delight. "Just a few months ago, this was all just seeds in the ground. It's amazing what a little patience and hard work can do," I replied, feeling the weight of those words settle in a new way. They were true not only of the garden, but of us, too. As summer crept in, bringing with it long, warm days and cool, clear nights, the farm became a place of constant motion. The harvest was abundant, and the days were filled with laughter and the satisfaction of seeing our hard work pay off. On weekends, we'd set up a small stand near the road, selling fresh vegetables to passers-by. More often than not, we'd spend hours just talking and laughing under the shade of a tree, Nora's hands busy with some small task, mine always finding a reason to reach for hers. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, the colors bleeding across the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a familiar warmth swell in my chest. Nora leaned her head against my shoulder, her hand resting in mine, and we sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the farm settling into the quiet of dusk. "This place is more than just a farm to me now," she said, her voice soft, almost to herself. "It feels like home." I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her closer. "That's because you made it one." She looked up at me, her gaze steady and warm. "I couldn't have done it alone, Will." We sat there, the air filled with the gentle hum of crickets and the distant call of an owl. In the quiet, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for every twist of fate that had brought us together. I knew, in that moment, that this was the life I wanted. A life built on love, on patience, on the quiet contentment that comes from truly knowing someone and being known in return. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, I felt an unshakable certainty that no matter what lay ahead, we'd face it together, side by side, here on this land that had witnessed the slow, steady growth of our love.